Welcome to Byte-Sized Tech. You know, where we blend those casual conversations with some insightful discussions on the latest tech and gadgets.
Always fun stuff.
Yeah, today we're diving into two pretty big stories, making some serious waves right now.
Right.
First, we're going to tackle the uncertain future of TikTok in the U.S. And then we'll kind of shift gears and explore how a potential Trump 2.0 administration might impact immigration policy.
It's pretty interesting how these stories, though they seem kind of unrelated, at first glance, they both actually touch on this complex interplay between technology and government.
Well, for sure.
And private enterprise, too.
Yeah.
Buckle up, because things could get pretty interesting.
Okay, so let's start with TikTok. There's a January 19th deadline looming that could dramatically change things for millions of users.
Right.
What's the deal with this deadline?
Well, the deadline actually stems from a law that was unanimously upheld by a D.C. court back in November.
Okay.
And it essentially mandates that TikTok, owned by the Chinese company ByteDance,
Right.
must either be banned outright or sold to a U.S. entity.
Wow.
So the legal pressure is immense at this point.
Yeah.
Makes it really difficult for TikTok to fight back effectively.
So are we really talking about like a complete ban here? It's wild to think that we might be saying goodbye to, those viral dance challenges and those funny cat videos.
Yeah, it's a possibility for sure.
Didn't former President Trump try to do something similar a while back?
He did. Yeah, back then he was really pushing for a ban, citing national security concerns due to TikTok's Chinese ownership.
Right.
But here's the interesting thing. Even he seems to have kind of softened his stance now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why the change of heart?
Well, some speculate that it might be because of the potential impact on TikTok's competitors.
Okay.
Particularly Meta, the company that owns Instagram.
Right.
Imagine the potential windfall for platforms like Instagram Reels or Snapchat Spotlight if TikTok just vanishes.
Yeah.
They'd be perfectly positioned to just absorb all those users and become the new hubs for, short-form video content.
It's like a domino effect.
TikTok goes down, and then others kind of benefit from that. But hold on. Wouldn't a ban affect the average TikTok user? And more importantly, like those creators who've built their entire careers on the platform?
Absolutely.
What happens to them?
Well, a ban or sale would undoubtedly force a massive shift in how we both consume and create content online.
For sure.
Those viral TikTok trends might start popping up on Instagram Reels or Snapchat Spotlight instead.
Yeah.
It would definitely reshape the social media landscape as we know it.
Yeah, that's a huge change.
It is.
What about the creators? Will they be able to transition smoothly to new platforms, or will some of them be left behind?
That's a great question, and it really highlights how these macro-level decisions can have really profound effects on individual livelihoods.
Yeah.
Some creators might be able to leverage their existing audiences and adapt their content to new platforms, but others might struggle to regain the same level of engagement that they had on TikTok.
It's almost like an ecosystem, isn't it?
It is.
Everything is so connected. Exactly. And when a major player like TikTok is suddenly removed, the ripple effects can be felt throughout the entire system.
Okay, so we've got this potential social media upheaval with TikTok's uncertain future.
Right.
Now let's switch gears to our second big story. You mentioned a possible Trump 2.0 administration.
Yeah.
How might this impact immigration policy in the U.S.?
Well, this is where those connections between government policy and the private sector become really apparent.
Okay.
One of the key promises of a potential Trump 2.0 administration is the deportation of millions of undocumented workers.
Okay.
And it's a massive undertaking that could significantly reshape how the U.S. approaches immigration enforcement.
Millions. That sounds incredibly ambitious, not to mention controversial.
It is.
How would they even begin to tackle something of that scale?
Well, traditionally, agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE and Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, they handle immigration enforcement.
Right.
However, the sheer scale of this proposed deportation program might necessitate a different approach.
What do you mean by a different approach?
Well, over recent decades, there's been a growing trend of shrinking the government and outsourcing tasks to the private sector.
Okay.
We see this in areas like defense contracting, prison management, and even healthcare.
So you're suggesting that private companies could potentially play a role in immigration enforcement, too?
Exactly. Think about the logistics involved in deporting millions of people.
Yeah.
You'd need detention centers, transportation processing facilities, and a whole host of other services.
Right.
All of these are areas where private companies could potentially step in.
Hold on, are we talking about private companies actually building and running detention centers? Doesn't that raise some serious ethical concerns about accountability and transparency?
It definitely raises concerns. After all, we're talking about people's lives and fundamental rights.
Yeah.
However, proponents of this approach argue that the private sector can often operate more efficiently and effectively than government agencies. They point to the potential for streamlined processes and cost savings.
So it's like a trade-off.
Right.
You might gain efficiency, but at what cost?
Exactly.
Are we willing to compromise on ethical considerations for the sake of expediency?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that fuels heated debate on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. It sounds like there are no easy answers here.
You're absolutely right. These are complex issues with far-reaching implications.
This has been a fascinating start to our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got TikTok's future kind of hanging in the balance,
Right.
and a potential shift in immigration policy that could have massive ripple effects across society.
Absolutely.
It really makes you wonder what's next,
What stands out to you so far?
honestly. I'm struck by how these two stories, though, seemingly unrelated on the surface,
Yeah.
are actually connected by this underlying thread of technology government and the private sector.
That's a great observation.
It's like this tangled web.
It highlights how interconnected our world truly is.
Yeah.
Decisions made in one area can have unforeseen consequences in others. And as we delve deeper into these topics, it'll be interesting to see how those connections play out.
For sure. We were just talking about how a potential Trump 2.0 administration might approach this challenge of deporting millions of undocumented workers.
Right.
You mentioned the possibility of involving private companies,
Mm-hmm.
which raises a lot of ethical concerns.
It does, but remember, this idea of involving the private sector isn't entirely new.
Right.
We've already seen examples of this happening in other areas that were traditionally handled by the government.
Okay, give me an example. What kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, take companies like Halliburton, for instance.
Okay.
They've been heavily involved in providing logistical support for military operations for years.
Right.
They manage things like food services, housing, and even transportation for troops overseas.
So basically taking on roles that were once considered the sole responsibility of the government.
Exactly. And this trend has been gaining momentum across various sectors for decades now. Proponents argue that the private sector can often handle these tasks more efficiently and without all the bureaucratic hurdles that sometimes slow down government agencies.
But efficiency isn't the only factor to consider,
Right.
especially when we're dealing with something as sensitive as immigration enforcement.
Absolutely.
What about accountability and transparency?
Mhm.
How do we ensure that private companies driven by profit motives uphold the same ethical standards and respect for human rights as we expect from government agencies?
You bring up a crucial point, and that's precisely why this debate is so complex and emotionally charged.
Yeah.
It's not simply a matter of finding the cheapest or fastest solution.
Right.
We need to weigh those practical considerations against ethical concerns, transparency, and the potential for abuse.
It feels like we're walking a tightrope here,
Yeah.
trying to balance competing priorities without losing sight of the human impact of these decisions.
That's a great analogy, and as with any tightrope walk, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
We're talking about the lives and well-being of real people.
Absolutely.
So it's essential to consider the potential consequences, both intended and unintended, of entrusting such a sensitive area of government responsibility to the private sector.
We've talked about the potential role of private companies.
Right.
But let's not lose sight of the individuals at the heart of this issue,
Mm-hmm.
the undocumented workers themselves.
For sure.
What would the potential impact be on them and their families?
It's a critical question and one that often gets overshadowed by all the political rhetoric surrounding this issue.
Yeah.
The human impact could be profound. We're talking about potential separation of families, economic hardship, and a heightened climate of fear and uncertainty within communities.
It's like a ripple effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
One policy decision can set off this chain reaction
Exactly.
with consequences that touch countless lives.
Precisely. And it's crucial to remember that we're not just dealing with abstract numbers or statistics here.
Right.
These are real people with hopes, dreams, and families just like anyone else.
Shifting gears back to TikTok for a second. How are these larger discussions around government regulation and the role of private companies playing out in the tech world? I mean, TikTok isn't the only platform facing scrutiny, right?
Absolutely not. We're seeing similar concerns about data privacy, content moderation, and market dominance play out with other tech giants like Facebook, Google, and Amazon.
So what does this mean for the future of the internet?
Mm-hmm.
Are we heading towards a more fragmented and regulated online world?
Yeah.
Or will these companies find ways to navigate these challenges and maintain their dominance?
That's the billion-dollar question, and honestly, nobody has a crystal ball.
Right.
What we do know is that the relationship between technology, government, and private enterprise is becoming increasingly complex and intertwined.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory here,
Yeah.
trying to figure out the rules of the game as we go along.
In a way, that's true, but it's also an exciting time to be engaged in these conversations.
For sure.
The decisions we make now will shape the digital landscape for generations to come.
This all makes me wonder about the ethical implications of relying so heavily on these tech platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Are we becoming too dependent on companies that ultimately prioritize profit over people?
It's a valid concern as these platforms become more and more integrated into our lives. It's essential to be mindful of the potential power they wield.
Right.
And to advocate for policies that prioritize user privacy, data security, and ethical algorithms.
So what can we as individuals do to ensure that technology serves us rather than the other way around?
Mm-hmm.
It feels overwhelming sometimes, like these issues are too big for any one person to make a difference.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that collective action starts with individual awareness and engagement.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today, from TikTok's uncertain future to the potential impact of a Trump 2.0 administration on immigration policy, and even dove into the ethical considerations of private companies taking on those traditionally governmental roles.
It's been quite a journey. Exploring how technology, government, and private enterprise are becoming increasingly intertwined, shaping the world we live in.
Right.
And raising a whole host of complex questions.
It feels like we've peeled back the layers of these stories to reveal this network of connections that most people probably don't even realize are there.
Exactly. And hopefully in doing so, we've sparked some thoughtful reflection and encouraged our listeners to, consider the bigger picture and how these seemingly separate issues are actually interconnected.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what are some key takeaways that our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's crucial to remember that we're living in an era of rapid change, and unprecedented interconnectedness. Decisions made in one sphere can have ripple effects across multiple domains, often in ways that are really difficult to predict.
Kind of like that butterfly effect thing, right?
Exactly.
A tiny flap of wings in one part of the world can eventually link to a hurricane somewhere else.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to think critically about the information we consume, and to engage in meaningful conversations about the kind of future we want to create.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of these issues.
It is.
But, we're not just passive bystanders in all of this.
Right.
We have a voice, and we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's through our choices as consumers, our participation in the political process, or even simply by engaging in thoughtful dialogue with others, we all have the power to shape the world around us.
So what are some concrete steps that listeners can take to, make their voices heard and engage in these important conversations?
There's so many ways to get involved. You can start by following reputable news sources that cover these topics, contacting your elected officials to express your views, supporting organizations that advocate for policies you believe in, and even just having open and honest conversations with friends and family about these issues. Every little bit counts.
It's empowering to think about, actually, we're not powerless in the face of these complex challenges.
Exactly. We have agency, and we can use it to create positive change.
So as we sign off for today, what's one final thought-provoking question we leave our listeners with? Something that will kind of stick with them and encourage them to keep thinking about these issues even after the episode ends.
How about this? As technology continues to evolve at a breakneck pace, how do we ensure that it serves humanity rather than the other way around?
Ooh.
It's a question that will continue to challenge us in the years to come, and one that requires our thoughtful engagement and proactive action.
That's a great question to ponder. And on that note, we've reached the end of our Byte-Sized Tech journey for today. Thanks for tuning in to Byte-Sized Tech. If you enjoyed the episode, like, comment, share, and subscribe for more fun tech discussions.